All right, so Fiona, if you could just tell people a little bit about yourself. Welcome everybody. This is Kinsey Poetic Soul. I have Fionna Mackintosh with me, who is a writer, a creator, and she has her own business helping women. And I'm gonna let her introduce herself to you guys.
Hey, Kenzie, it's great to be here. So my name's Fionna Mackintosh, and I have a business where I coach female entrepreneurs and female creatives. And my focus is largely on storytelling. So whether that's storytelling in terms of writing or in terms of um, just how we use narrative in our businesses. Or in our lives, because our lives are made up of story. And story is how we create meaning in our worlds in terms of the experiences that we go through. So that's my focus. My business background, I probably well, the quickest way to describe that is I've spent 20 years in public service in government. And so I also bring the business planning and policy kind of discipline that I learned there into what I do as well. So, but my main focus is on storytelling.
Awesome. So there's so much that comes with storytelling. As many of you know, I myself am a storyteller. And what I want to really talk about today is being a female creative and what that looks like emotionally, as far as from a mental health perspective. How do we keep our stuff together when we are creating and often writing such emotional pieces? And this is ironic that me and Fiona are having this conversation because, as many of you know, I'm currently in the process of writing a book, and she actually has been one of my coaches to help me throughout that process. And so, which kind of sparked the idea for this chat. So, I'm going to ask Fiona a couple of questions, and we're just going to talk. So, Fiona, if you don't mind me asking you, what inspires you to write? I know me personally, I've been writing for a long time, since I was 6, and I'm often inspired by, ironically, pain. And it can be difficult to write very painful experiences and force yourself to relive them, to write them. Then you have to go back to your daily life. So, what do you think about that?
So, so let me start with the pain piece, and then we'll go from there. So I started writing. Well, the first piece of poetry I have, I wrote when I was 10. I think I was writing before then, but that's like the first piece of concrete writing I saved. And for me, writing was a way of exploring. To make a long story short, I had a pretty intense childhood from a lot of different angles. I grew up in a fundamentalist, somewhat evangelical, but fundamentalist church family. And so there were a lot of different levels of pain that I was processing.
Right.
Both as a female and just as a human, because for folks who've grown up in fundamentalist backgrounds, know there's a lot of control in communities that's exercised through shame. So for me as a teenager, writing was a way of expressing myself in relation to things that I saw going on in the world, either personally or on a bigger level,
Right.
and trying to find some way to express how those were making me feel. So right. to get into the feeling side of it, for me, a lot of that was rage. And I have a thing about injustice, which, wasn't particularly a woke form of justice when I was 10 years old. Right. but so some of that poetry when I was a teenager, I was writing about, you know, Sandinistas and the Contras in terms of the conflict in Honduras, Palestinian land issues in terms of the single state, two state issues as they play out in the Middle East. And so I was grappling with these really large.
At 10, that's amazing.
Well, I was a little older than 10. That was when I was a teenager.
Okay, still.
But grappling with those larger issues gave me a way to express the personal.
Right.
At enough of a distance from myself that I could still get up and go to school. I could still function. So maybe I'll stop talking there and see what you're thinking.
Yeah, and I think that in those situations, the writing becomes the medicine, right? Like, and I've been there with my own childhood and dealing with a family that is very religious. I can kind of understand where you're coming from, where it's like sometimes the writing is the only form of escape you have, and so you use that to kind of go into another world and forget about reality. And for many young girls and young people, writing is the therapy, right? So you know, and then when you're an author, you are not only writing to heal, but you're also writing to help people, and you're writing to tell a story. And so you have to go into, for many people, reliving your own story in order to tell and help others, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about what you do, helping women and other people to tell their story. And so what is that like for you?
It's both a joy, because it really is a joy. Helping women really tap into work through and tap into their voice, and watching the energy that gets released when people step into that power of who they authentically are and can then express from that place, is just super, super, super powerful. So so that's kind of part of what I get out of it. And I think, you know, the other piece is going back to your kind of question on what writers and what storytellers are doing in the world. So on my profile, I have a word I made up. Well, I didn't. I stuck two words together. So poet, storyteller, word healer. And the reason we had word healer up there is that writers and storytellers can do, well, I mean, it can do a lot of things, but for the sake of discussion, to simplify it, they can heal or they can harm. And so there is this conversation that has not been happening around the ethics of storytelling and around the ethics of what it means to have the kind of power that storytellers have. Back in the day, people used to go through apprenticeships for it, back in the day. But they did, right? So they would be apprenticed to an elder in a community or to the community storyteller, and they would learn from them.
Wow.
And part of what they were learning was the responsibility of the role. And what it meant to have that kind of role in a community. So, in our atomized world, where now storytellers are not necessarily physically located in a community, and we're all kind of behind our keyboards.
Literally.
Yes. I think some of that apprenticeship piece has turned into a very mechanical kind of, these are the crafts that you need, this is the craft you need to know as a writer, sentence structure and how to form paragraphs and all that jazz, vocabulary. And then there's the art of being a storyteller, but there's not a lot of discussion around what it actually means from an ethical perspective. So I think the result of that is that you actually end up with a lot of people who have this power, where when it's not guided, it can do extreme amounts of harm.
Absolutely. I think that is a tremendous point that you've made that I don't even think I myself have thought about. What happens when storytellers are not given the proper tools to utilize their greatness. And I think that when we look at, some of the greatest storytellers of all time, we see that sometimes when, like you say, they don't have the right people around them, when they're not doing the mental work that goes along with, when then they're not heeding to the responsibility that comes with it, that's when the pain can come, right? That's when the stories you tell can kind of drive you crazy. I remember looking at a movie, and one of the actors was a madman essentially, and he talked about the role and how the role messed with him. And so as a storyteller, specifically when you're telling personal stories, it can mess with your head literally. And so you do have to make sure that you're doing that ethical work to take care of yourself.
Yeah. And so the self-care piece, I think I got some echo there. Oh, I'm okay. So the self-care piece is equally important to the ethical piece. And I think, Neil Gaiman, who is a science fiction / comic / fantasy / children's author, he's pretty prolific. But he talks about, and it's not his concept, it's borrowed from someone else, but he talks about how all of the experiences we have in our lives, all the books we read, movies we watch, experiences we go through, are compost for the writer's imagination.
Absolutely.
And so if we're not paying attention to what's in our compost, and if we haven't properly been looking after that compost heap, now I'm taking the analogy further than Neil did, but then, there may be stuff in that compost that's not healthy for the soil. There may be stuff in that compost that will not help things grow, that will kill things. So for example, you probably don't want to be dumping your salt into the compost pile. So, part of the work from a mental health perspective is the work of making sure that what's in your compost heap is not poisoning the soil you draw from creatively and imaginatively. If that makes sense.
It does. It makes perfect sense. And I think that that's so important, because the place that we draw from our inspiration is so precious. We do have to take care of it and treasure it. And so I want to know, for you, do you ever get overwhelmed dealing with so many energies and stories that need to be told? How do you navigate that?
So here's what I would say about my toolkit. So coming out of my childhood, and my experiences as an early adult, I kind of stuck myself into counseling fairly early. And so I have had a ton of very, very good mental health professionals help me with my personal growth and development and journey along the way. So So I'm immensely privileged that way. And I say that like I grew up in countries where there is a national healthcare system, and where you're not having to balance choices about eating versus whether or not you can take care of your mental health.
Right. It can be tough.
Yeah, no, it can, right? Like, and I mean, and that's something that needs to be acknowledged. So, but as a result of that, I have tools in my toolkit that I can now use to help others and to also engage in self-care. So what does that look like for me? Part of it is boundaries. So no matter how tough the conversation is with someone, in terms of the personal emotional things they may be processing as they write, I don't internalize those and carry them with me.
Right. And that's important.
Yeah, because I'm no good to them if I do.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
If I end up enmeshed in that story with them, I'm lost in the forest with them. I've got no way of, I need to be removed enough that I can see where the breadcrumb trail is, to use a fairy tale metaphor.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, yeah, so boundaries, and then a whole bunch of other tools that I will admit I don't use consistently. Meditation, which I generally tend to use as a curative. So it's sort of like, I'll let my stress levels get to a certain point, and then you grab the meditation app and
I have to
and bring it down, instead of meditating every day where you're building your core resilience. So I'm not saying I use all my tools well, but I do have them, and I think that that's important. From a writing perspective, is how do you actually take care of yourself as you are writing and as you are processing these stories and as you are telling them and speaking them into the world?
Absolutely. And I think that you have a really good toolkit. I know for me personally, I'm currently working on my first novel, and it is it's an experience. Definitely. I had to kind of take a break just for my own sanity, because it was getting intense. And so I had to take a step back and go back to my own life and realize that, I have to turn it on and off. And so I think it's good that you're able to do that, because it can be hard, especially for a first time writer or somebody that's just starting out, to kind of know how to turn that switch on and off.
Yeah. For sure.
Yeah.
And I think, what you're speaking about there is, or at least what I'm hearing, is around the vulnerability of the writer, in the process. And so, you're stepping back from it is a really good, healthy way of processing, right? Because it gives you the space to separate yourself from, and not be enmeshed in the story. Just step back and look after your mental health.
Right. Yeah, it's a conscious decision that I think that we as a community need to make sometimes, that it's okay to step back and turn the laptop off, put the pen down sometimes.
Yeah. And I think writers are asked maybe the wrong word. Writers need to be able to be vulnerable emotionally when they write.
Yeah.
From an authenticity perspective. And so Neil Gaiman actually, sorry, I'm just going to keep talking about Neil. As you can tell, I may be a bit of a fangirl. So, but one of the things he talks about is how, like the apprenticeship of him as a writer, in terms of his growth. And he talks about how one of the turning points for him was being at a Clarion workshop, I think it was, but he was with a bunch of older women. I don't know whether he was the only dude in the workshop or quite how that worked. But they were workshopping their writing, and he said it was, that was one of the places where he came to realize that
You're breaking up just a tad bit. Breaking up a tad.
Allowed himself to be emotionally vulnerable writing.
Okay.
Oh, hold on. Am I coming through?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Sorry, you would think that in the middle of a large cosmopolitan city, I would have better internet connection, but I'm sitting beside my router, and here we are.
Right. It has a mind of its own.
Yeah. So for him, it was sort of like he realized that in order to be as powerfully present as a storyteller as he wanted to be, he needed to let down his emotional guard when he was writing in order to tap into that compost, or in order to tap into that power, that imaginative power, and that leaves you emotionally vulnerable. So then you need to have ways to look after yourself.
Yes, you do. And knowing that going in is good, because sometimes as a beginner, you don't know that going in. And so it's good that as a seasoned writer, he was able to know that and kind of help other people. And so I want to talk a little bit about your personal process when writing. I've kind of shared a little bit about my process as far as taking a step back. And so when you are writing, drawing from personal experiences, does your process look similar to when you're coaching? Like, what does that look like for you?
So I'm going to go back a little bit in history to tell you what my writing process used to look like. So, and then you'll understand why when I then tell you what it looks like now. So my writing process when I was a teenager and a young adult was often what I would call a triggered writing process. So something would happen and I would be outraged or enraged by the injustice, by whatever the thing was. And the only way I had of processing that was poetry. And so for a long time, I think I thought the only way I could write was if I was enraged.
Right.
And so my creativity, the source of my creativity, I had hooked it into rage. Which, let me tell you, is a pretty charged space to live in if you actually want to write consistently. Because walking around in a state of rage all the time just so that you can write, it's not healthy.
No.
And so for me, the last decade really has been separating my sense of creativity from the emotion that I tapped into when I first started writing, because I had collapsed the two together. And so thankfully I can say I no longer have to be enraged in order to tap into creativity. So I've done enough healing that I can now separate my creativity from that trigger. And now I've forgotten the question, so I have no idea if I'm answering it.
Okay, I kind of forgot it too, just listening to you. It was making me think of thoughts. And I realized that, I kind of started the same way as a child, just being triggered by things happening during my childhood, being bullied and feeling like I didn't belong, feeling like I didn't fit in. And I think even now, when I look at my kind of process stepping back from the writing, a lot of it was because doing the writing itself was triggering me. And so you do realize, you said something important. You said you realized you hadn't healed. You have to heal, I think, to write it really successfully and still be okay coming out on the other side, mentally. For your own sanity.
And so one of the processes, because I think you and I have chatted before about the ways in which writing is autobiographical. And how the writing process is. And I mean, I'll just tie that back to the compost heap, right? Which is, that's where writers draw from, is that compost heap of experiences and everything they've encountered. That doesn't mean every character in a book is the author. But part of that is, as you're writing, if you're tapping into that emotional space to be able to channel, for want of a better word, a particular type of character, you need to process that at two levels as a writer, right? So there's the craft piece of it, but if you've got unresolved issues relating to something that those emotions connect to, so say for example, if you have a death in the family that for whatever reason was not talked about, not emotionally processed, and you end up writing, maybe you end up writing a mystery about someone who dies and they disappear. And so there's all of these unresolved issues around the death.
Yeah.
So you're going to be tapping into your own emotional experience of that as you're writing.
Absolutely.
And so that's going to bring shit up. Pardon my language. It's going to bring shit up. And so that's where it's really important to have self-awareness, to kind of be able to look after yourself in that moment. And honor your past.
Absolutely. And you said something really important. You said be present in that moment and realize that even though you're writing, you're still living and life happens. Stuff happens. So we have to stay present in those moments and realize that sometimes it's okay to put writing on hold so that we can deal with life. Because we need life to be okay so that we can be effective writers.
And also I think, and I'm realizing this more and more for myself, as someone who, it's hard to write I'm not even sure it's possible as a writer to write if you're disconnected from life.
Absolutely.
What that looks like for individual writers might be different, because everyone is at different places on the extroversion introversion continuum. But the richness of the story kind of depends on you being engaged with life.
Absolutely. It does. Because you have to be able to pull from those emotional experiences and still find joy and happiness at the end of the day,
Yes.
So that kind of brings me into kind of the last thing I want to talk about, which is we started off kind of talking about being a female writer. We're both female writers. You work with female writers. And so I want to ask you, what do you think is the hardest part about being a female writer? And do you think, dun, 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 this is the age-old question, do you think that female writers are more emotional than male writers? I'm going to let you give what you think before I give what I think.
So if I had answered that question when I was 20, you and I would be having a very different conversation than we're about to have. So one is a biological answer and one is a socialization answer. So what I would say is we are not biologically more emotional. However, I think that there are ways in which genders are socialized in terms of accessing emotion and expressing emotion, where women have permission to access a broader range. And so in a way that actually makes us so my head tilting, although people won't be able to see that, I was just recording. So my pause was around, I don't want to say it makes it easier for us as writers. Because it's not a competition, but two, also because, there's lots of ways in which being a female writer is definitely not easier.
Right, there is.
but what I would but what I would say is that those are tools we already have in our toolkit that we don't need to learn in terms of accessing that broader range of emotion. There are lots of dudes out there who are not emotionally shut off from themselves, though. So again, we're talking in generalizations here, and so trying to think about an I'm trying to think about an example that I can name, where I would say, you know, this is a writer who is male, and the writing really resonates emotionally, and I you know what, I'm not going to push it because something will come to me. So I would say it's a complicated conversation, but I think women probably have an easier time with a broader range of emotional expression because we're socialized to.
I would agree. And I kind of think that even just as you were talking, I was trying to think of a male writer that really puts me in my emotions the way a female writer does, and I couldn't. So I think that, I don't want to say women are better writers. I think that because I think that because of socialization, it makes it easier for us to access our bank of emotions, like you were saying, which in turn makes it easier for us, you know. And I think that sometimes because men are kind of socialized not to really tap into their emotions, it could be more difficult for them to do that when writing. So that may even be cause for them to do more self-care when they're writing than maybe even we need to do, because they're using muscles that they don't normally use. And when it comes to us, we're using muscles that we've been socialized to use.
Yes. And, you know, it's interesting that you bring this up because I have a friend who is an author. I won't name her just because the situation is live and ongoing at the moment. But her writing, actually, you know what, I will name her. So her name's Sarah Chorn, and she is a fantasy author-ish, kind of. She doesn't really fit a genre, who is one of the most incredibly gifted and powerful writers I have ever read in terms of emotion.
Wow.
And in terms of being able to take a character and just make them bleed on the page.
Mhm.
And I would say for her, like even as a female writer, she kind of stands above any writer I've ever read in terms of that full range of human emotion being expressed in the writing. And people either hate her like passionately, or they're like, oh my God, you're doing something like it's brilliant, and it's like we've never seen this before, and it's new. And then there's this pushback, which is your characters are too emotional, there's not enough action, you need more armies, whatever the thing is, right?
Right.
Writes fantasy. And so there's this really interesting dynamic that her readers and other writers bring to encountering her work. And it all has to do with the emotionality of the characters.
Right. And maybe because she is a female writer, it's easier for her to draw on that. But I just think it's so interesting because when I think of all the writers, to me, that bleed on the page, like for one, Maya Angelou, it may be cliche,
Yep.
but I love her. She's one of my favorite authors. And I just thinking of her poems throughout my childhood made me cry because
Yeah.
of the way that she was so in tune with her emotion.
Yeah.
And I think it's a powerful thing. It's almost a superpower that women have, right?
Yeah.
And we really, we have to continue to tap into that and be
Yeah.
mindful of it at the same time.
Yeah. And I mean, I think so my long pause there was I was going back to sort of the broader storytelling in my head, and I hope I get her name right, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and her Danger of a Single Story TED Talk.
I
And
love that TED
how
Talk.
I know it's awesome. um, it's like there's just so much in that 15 minutes, and you're just like, and it's so profoundly altering in terms of how I approach
Could you
how
give
I
me,
approach.
I'm sorry, I have to,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, you guys, I have to use the bathroom, so give me just a moment. I'll be
we
right
come back.
back.
That's
I'll be
okay. We'll
right
go
back.
back to the TED Talk when you get back.
Okay, I'm back. Hopefully you remember everything that you had.
TED Talk. So I can't remember why I was talking about it, but
Danger of a Single Story.
yeah. So Danger of a Single Story.
TED Talk.
TED Talks. I think the reason I was talking about it, what had to do with, again, coming back to sort of what is storytelling, and what are the ethics of storytelling, and what do we need to be self-aware of in terms of our emotional histories and how that might impact what we choose as a writer, right? So she talked about how when she was growing up, she read sort of traditional British storytelling fare. And so, never contemplated even that characters in a book could be anything other than white little blonde girls with pigtails.
Right.
Until she was exposed a little older to, I think it was Nigerian storytelling, if my recollection serves, but
Very different.
to then be able to go, hey, we can actually tell stories about people who look like me, who have lived like me, who don't live in England and go to boarding school, and that opened up this whole kind of new world for her as a writer, in terms of being able to then enter into storytelling in a whole new way. And I think, the flip side of that for me is the conversation with readers, because readers have these expectations, I think, around what stories are when they come to them, right?
Right.
So what are their expectations? And for different genres, that's going to be different expectations. But one of the things I think, because broad inclusion from a writing perspective is very new. It's not that there haven't been female writers or BIPOC writers around since forever,
Right.
but they haven't been included in the educational canon, and so they're new in that sense. Is we have barely, I think, tapped into the power of storytelling as writers.
Absolutely.
And that is both enormously exciting and terrifying at the same time.
At the same time.
So, because it opens up it opens up human possibilities.
Absolutely.
And so finding a way to encourage readers to embrace and to just kind of leap into that with curiosity, I think it's really, really important. I didn't realize as a reader myself how limited my reading was until about 5 or 6 years ago. And when I realized how dominated my reading was by white American authors, I started deliberately broadening out who I was reading. So now I read Scottish writers, I read Nigerian writers, and that makes me a better writer.
Right.
So it, because whether it's craft or whether it's the actual story, the more I am willing to learn about storytelling, the better I am as a writer.
Absolutely. And you brought up a great point, which is perspective, right? Many on my channel know I'm a teacher, so I could go on and on about perspective and the dangers of a single story. I really could. And it's so important to have multiple perspectives in writing. It's important for mental health, for both the reader and the writer. And it does help you as a writer, having those multiple perspectives to be a better writer when you are reading about people that are not just like you, people that are different than you, people that are different cultures, ethnicities, that helps you to be able to pull from a space to bring more to your readers. And I think that that's something that needs to be noted.
Yeah. And you know, I think about this even when I'm walking around my own neighborhood, which is pretty white, although it is getting slightly more diverse in the last few years, which is good. And how as humans, so this isn't a writer issue, but as humans, we tend to limit ourselves to certain geographic regions, right, in our cities. And so it's sort of like, even though I live right next to the community of the Junction, I hardly ever go there because I just don't go north, right? So I go east and I go west and
create our own borders.
And even though the Junction, I can look out my window and see it, when I go up there, it's like, it is like visiting a different place, right? Because culturally that neighborhood is different than this one. And so I think this goes back to what are the ethics of storytelling question at the beginning, which is, and then linking that to the danger of a single story, which is, can you actually be a storyteller if you never leave your neighborhood?
Now there's a question. That is a question. Or an effective one. I mean, can you be an effective one?
Yes, yes, yes.
And even now, with me writing the story and even meeting you and others like you in my writing groups, I'm realizing, even as a marginalized person or as an African-American woman, that my perspective is skewed too. I only really read Black literature growing up, you know, some white in school, but you know, what I preferred. And so realizing that it's important to go outside of your comfort zone and to familiarize yourself with the people that came before you in whatever genre you're reading, no matter their color.
Yeah.
You know.
And I had this hilarious conversation yesterday with a Blackfoot Cree author. And he has moved out to the Atlantic coast because that's where his partner is. So he's in Mi'kmaq territory, and that's Atlantic coast, right? So it's lobster bakes, it's a lot of shellfish. for him, right? And he said, he grew up with salmon. So he's good with that from a fish perspective, but like all of the shellfish, he's like, what is this?
What?
And I was laughing because I said to him, that's my like the Atlantic culture around the sea. I totally get that, right? Because I grew up on the northwest coast of Scotland, and we we grew up eating shellfish and eating my mom spent chunks of her time harvesting sea snails, which she would then sell to a dealer in France. So in a way, it was sort of like this really funny moment where I had more in common with the Mi'kmaq in terms of their traditional Atlantic practices than he did as a Blackfoot Cree from the prairies, right? And so there's this really interesting way in which we think about what is community and what is identity.
Yeah. Is it really as constricted as, is community really as constricted as we say it is? It really isn't, because we're all people.
I don't think it is. I think we make it constricted.
Yeah. I agree.
And there's a whole lot of reasons for why we do that, which we're probably don't have time to talk about, but
we could talk about those all night long.
Yes. So I think we've wandered a bit maybe from the mental health piece that we started with, but
yes. And I think this is kind of a good ending, because you kind of answered my last question. And so I really enjoyed this conversation. I think that from a mental health perspective, we really touched on some great things that female writers can do and should do to keep themselves grounded during this time. And this goes for Black writers, white writers, Indian writers, any race or ethnicity of writers. I think it's important mentally to take care of yourself and to step outside of your comfort zone sometimes. Read authors that are not your normal author to help you to be a better storyteller. And so do you have any closing thoughts or things you want to add before we kind of wrap up?
So my closing thoughts, I'm actually super excited because despite the craziness of the last, half decade politically, I see this energy rising, this creative energy rising, which is pushing at the boundaries of what we think we know. Absolutely. And that's being done through storytelling. And for me, that's massively exciting, right? And I think, the ways in which storytellers shape the future by writing or orally telling stories about where we are and where we've been and where we might go is almost experiencing this renaissance, right? Because we are recognizing the dangers of a single story, and we are recognizing the ways in which storytelling can either put us to sleep, as Dr. Martin Shaw would say, or wake us from a spell. Absolutely. And so I'm hopeful, and I'm excited. And I'm looking forward to all the stories that are going to emerge.
I am too. I think this year is going to be a game changer. I think the climate of storytelling, as you stated, is different. And I think that we are all going to be surprised by what we find and by the people that are able to catch our attention that maybe we never really thought about before, but their stories are needed.
Yes.
It's time.
It is past time. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Fionna, and thank you so much for watching, guys. And I hope that everyone has a blessed night.
Bye. It's a joy to speaking.